I think I read this yesterday. The real work. There's one thing in this world that you must never forget to do. If you forget everything else and not this, there's nothing to worry about. But if you remember everything else and forget this, then you will have done nothing in your life. It's as if a king has sent you to some country to do a task, and you perform 100 other services, but not the one he sent you to do. So, human beings come to this world to do a particular work. That work is the purpose, and each is specific to the person. If you don't do it, it's as though a priceless Indian sword were used to slice rotten meat. It's a golden bowl being used to cook turnips, when one filing from the bowl could buy 100 suitable pots. It's a knife of the finest tempering nailed into a wall to hang things on. You say, but look, I'm using the dagger. It's not lying idle. Do you hear how ludicrous that sounds? For a penny, an iron nail could be bought to serve the purpose. You say, but I spend my energies on lofty enterprises. I study law and philosophy and logic and astronomy and medicine and all the rest. But consider why you do these things. They are branches of yourself. Remember the deep root of your being, the presence of your Lord. Give your life to the one who already owns your breath and your moments. If you don't, you will be exactly like the man who takes a precious dagger and hammers it into his kitchen wall for a peg to hold his dipper gourd. You will be wasting valuable keenness and foolishly ignoring your dignity and your purpose. So this next little riff is at the tail end of Inayat Khan's book, The Soul Whence and Whither, which has been republished as The Soul's Journey, available from Omega Press, cover art by yours truly. What is this journey taken by the soul from the source to manifestation, and from manifestation back to the same source, which is the goal? Is it a journey, or is it not a journey? It is not a journey in truth. It is a change of experience, which makes it a journey, a story, and yet a whole journey produced in moving pictures is in one film which does not journey for miles and miles as it appears to do on the screen. Do many journey, or one? Many while still in illusion, and one when the spirit has disillusioned itself. Who journeys? Is it oneself or God? Both and yet one, the two ends of one line. What is the nature and character of this manifestation? It is an interesting dream. What is this illusion caused by? By cover upon cover, the soul is covered by 1,000 veils. Do these covers give happiness to the soul? Not happiness, but intoxication. The further the soul is removed from its source, the greater the intoxication. Does this intoxication help the purpose of the soul's journey towards its accomplishment? It does, in a way, but the purpose of the soul is accomplished by its longing. And what does it long for? Sobriety. And how is that sobriety attained? By throwing away the veils which have covered the soul and thus divided it from its real source and goal. What uncovers the soul from these veils of illusion? The change which is called death. This change can be forced upon the soul against its desire, and then it is called death. This is a most disagreeable experience. Like snatching away the bottle of wine from a drunken man, which is most painful to him for a time. Or the change can be brought about at will, and the soul throws away the cover that surrounds it and attains the same experience of sobriety while on earth, even if it be but a glimpse of it. This is the same experience which the soul arrives at after millions and millions of years drunk with illusion, and yet not exactly the same. The experience of the former is fana, annihilation, but the latter is baqa, the resurrection. The soul, drawn by the magnetic power of the divine spirit, falls into it with a joy inexpressible in words, as a loving heart lays itself down in the arms of its beloved. The increase of this joy is so great that nothing the soul has ever experienced has made it so unconscious of the self. But this unconsciousness of the self becomes, in reality, the true self-consciousness. It is then that the soul fully realizes, I exist. But the soul which arrives at this stage of realization consciously has a different experience. The experience is like that of one person having been pulled with his back turned to the source, and another person having journeyed towards the goal, enjoying at every step each experience it is met with, and rejoicing at every moment of this journey in approaching nearer the goal. What does this soul, conscious of its progress towards the goal, realize? It realizes with every veil it has thrown off a greater power, an increased inspiration, until it arrives at a stage, after having passed through the sphere of the jinns and the heaven of the angels, when it realizes the error which it had known, and yet not known fully, the error it had made in identifying itself with its reflection, with its shadow falling on these different planes. It is like the sun looking at the sunflower and thinking, I am the sunflower, forgetting at that moment that the sunflower is only its footprint. Neither on the earth plane was one one's own self, nor in the sphere of the jinns, nor in the heaven of the angels. One was only a captive of one's own illusion, caught in a frame. And yet not really inside it, it was only one's reflection. But one saw oneself nowhere, so one could only identify oneself with the various reflections until the soul realized, it is I who was, if there were any. What I had thought to be myself was not myself, but was my experience. I am all that there is, and it is myself who will be whoever there will be. It is I who am the source, the traveler, and the goal of this existence. So this word sobriety that he uses is another one of these code words that takes a lot of unpacking. And there's somewhere else, I think I have the document with me in electronic form. I don't have it in this mess I've created around my chair here, where Murshid likens the world to a tavern, and everyone in it is drinking their particular variety of intoxicant. And for some people their intoxicant is love, and for some people their intoxicant is success, and for some people their intoxicant is depression, and for some people their intoxicant is a large group of loving friends, and for some people their intoxicant is being lonely and miserable, and it goes on and on. And every so often Someone leaves the tavern for a breath of fresh air, and they go out and they take a breath and they sober up just a little bit. And the difference between, now this is my editorializing, the difference between this path and many other paths is that in some varieties of Buddhism and yoga, for example, they leave the tavern. And the Sufi says, life is life. And they go back into the tavern knowing what sobriety is and knowing what drunkenness is, and then consciously choosing their intoxicant. So, with regard to what I was saying a little bit earlier, when the ego hears about sobriety, it wants to make it right. It wants to make it the thing to do. And in that way, the ego just owns it, the way that it owns the rest of you. And there's really no waking up. It's just another intoxicant in that case. As Murshid says, the divine message is a call to awaken, whose time it is for awakening, and it's a lullaby for those whose time it is yet to sleep. And that has many, many levels. So one of the things we're going to work with today, or at least touch upon, is the nature of, to getting a little bit more granular about the intoxicants that we carry with us, all of these different facets of who we take ourselves to be, which we call impressions. And these impressions are many and they are varied. And some of these impressions are, we could also call them identities or identifications. So we're identified with our physical bodies, we're identified with our gender, we're identified with the things that have happened to us in our lifetimes, our personal history. We're identified with all of what that means, the storyline, the movie of our lives, the script that we are the script writers of, the director of, the producer of, and the starring role. And from the perspective of awakening, it doesn't matter really whether the movie is a tragedy, a comedy, a love story, a drama. It's all just a story. Now, on balance, I would say that it's probably less painful to have a beautiful story, but it's still a story, and it's still not being awake. And that's not to say that being awake is somehow better, as though the story is being judged. Because it's real easy hearing what I'm saying to think that we're making a judgment about it. We're not. Simply know what your story is. Know what your intoxicants are. Choose them consciously. But in order to choose them consciously, you have to at least know what sobriety is and be able to inhabit sobriety when the time comes to do that. What we call sobriety, or what we might call awakening, or enlightenment is not better or worse, but it is the natural condition of the human being. Everything else being these layers upon layers upon layers of seemingness that we cover ourselves with and through which we live out our lives and which act as filters on our experience, removing us from the true depth and richness with which we could be experiencing our life and aliveness. Since I live alone as a bachelor, from time to time, I'll just open a bag of chips for dinner. But it's not the same experience or carrying the same nutritive value as actually taking the time to steam some broccoli and put some chicken in the pan with spices and pour myself a half a glass of wine. Living life through who we take ourselves to be is really sort of like eating the bag that the chips came in. Or reading the menu instead of actually eating the meal. And we can't know that, really, until we get a glimpse behind the veils. And then there's this whole other life. And some people will take drugs to get that glimpse, and at least it's a glimpse of something else. But if your life to that point is in a darkened room and somebody raises the shade, even though the window is completely filthy and you can't really see what's outside, just having a little bit more light is like a revelation. And you go, oh my God, I had no idea. This is fabulous. Give me some more of this. But it's not the same as the shade going up on a clean window, and it is certainly not the same as actually going out the door. No comparison. So any questions or comments before, or anything from yesterday that may have been percolating?
Yes, how do we make ourselves more alive through breath?
Do that again?
How do we make ourselves more alive through breath? More conscious, more alert, more...
The exercise or the practice that we did yesterday of just attending to becoming aware of that current of breath between the inner and the outer and the outer and the inner, and that flow. The more aware we are of that, the more that we're present to it. At least having some tendril of our awareness draped over that movement helps a lot, because then you'll be more aware of just how big the pipe is, which is really enormous. It's much, much larger than anything in the physical realm. And if you just sit at that interface between the inner and the outer and feel the breath moving and work with the image that I gave of as we inhale on the physical plane, we're actually exhaling into the inner dimension. And as we exhale on the physical plane, we're actually inhaling from at the same time, as this kind of reciprocal mirroring of how the two worlds relate to each other. The inner reflecting the outer and the outer reflecting the inner. If you just hang out with that, in that awareness and feeling it, at a certain point, you will have the experience of what feels like you collapsing and spreading infinitely in all directions. And that your being, your beingness is that interface between the worlds. That's the reality. That's what's there, even after you get you get evicted from this body you're hitched to. So that's one thing. Anything you can do to increase the amount of life force that you run, and there's lots of practices and techniques for that. Just learning how to take a deeper breath more consistently instead of holding it. Most of us have a band of tension across our diaphragms that inhibits the free movement of the physical breath. And so we don't make ourselves available to as much life force as we could. Some of the zikr that we were doing last night with a little heavier, kind of raspy breathing is one of the things that the dervishes use to break up that tension across the diaphragm. And it's very effective for that. It really wasn't the time last night to go into that very deeply. It just was not that kind of zikr. But had we done so, that experience that you were speaking of yesterday with regard to feeling your middle kind of open up and become freer and more permeable, you could feel from head to toe. And you can feel your whole body, your whole aura breathing. The purification breaths help a lot. Qasab helps a lot. Once you get to the point of being able to comfortably retain a breath for a chunk of time, you work with increasing the length of time that you can hold the breath. And there's a whole technique to being able to retain the breath properly. In the manner of breath practice that we do in this order, we don't use the locks or the bandhas that are done in pranayama. There's a little bit different emphasis on how we do it in keeping the whole channel open. So, and this is something I'll go into later this afternoon about the kind of the mechanics of the basic breath practices that we do. But one of the keys is you inhale and then you simply stop. You don't close your throat. You just keep everything open. And you have to keep your chest at expansion. So developing the intercostal muscles to be able to support that is necessary. And as you do that, where you inhale and simply pause at the top of the inhale, with as deep an inhale as you can manage without straining, it's almost like you create almost a partial vacuum at a subtle energetic level that invites in more life force. And you can actually visualize yourself or feel yourself or think that you are drawing more life force from, as Murshid says, the sphere, from the environment, from where the life force just abides. And working with the chakras and the elements, which we're going to touch upon a little bit later today. Most of us carry impressions on our being, things that we identify with, just these little subtle facets of who we take ourselves to be. Each one of those is a little energy sink for our life force. Each one of those is part of the structure of the personality. Most of us live life through a personality that is rigid structure and basically reactive emotional patterning. And part of the goal of this, of the work that we're engaged in here, is to, through the various techniques of spiritual practice, the structure can become softer and more permeable and more pliable, and we can begin to live with more fluidity and more presence. But it involves some degree of inquiring into and just questioning the structure that we encounter and not taking it for granted. Then, of course, we have these conversations with ourselves about that whole thing, which is part of the journey. Inasmuch as it is necessary to cleanse and purify the body, so necessary, or perhaps even more necessary, is it that the mind be cleansed and purified. All impurity causes diseases as well as irregularity in the working of the physical system. The same applies to the mind. There are impurities belonging to the mind, which may cause different diseases, and by cleansing the mind, one helps to create health in both body and mind. By health, I mean the natural condition. And what is spirituality but to be natural? Very few think like this. So many people think that to be spiritual means to be able to work wonders, to be able to see strange things, wonderful phenomena. And very few know how simple it is that to be spiritual means to be natural. All I can do in the time that we have here is just barely knock a couple of molecules from the first molecular layer of this whole study of impressions. It's huge. But if I can just begin to give the basics, you can begin to follow it up yourself. I'll just repeat what he says about the natural condition of the mind. The mind is the surface of the heart, and the heart is the depth of the mind.
Can you repeat?
The heart is the depth of the mind, and the mind is the surface of the heart. He also goes into the nature of the mind and the heart. He says that the true nature of the mind is not thoughts, but simply mind. And the true nature of the heart is not love, but simply heart. That thoughts and love are really the outcomes or the products of mindness and heartness. The natural condition of the mind is like a perfectly polished mirror that reflects whatever is put before it, but the image doesn't stick, it simply reflects. So, if you put two mirrors together, this close, what's between them? Think back to the exercise that we did yesterday where we simply encountered each other. You might have had the experience of two mirrors and the spacious boundlessness that was between them. Anybody have that? Or think you had that? Even thinking you have it is fine. You know, that's good. That's an opening. Something that we're going to call, for lack of a better term, the purification of the mind means ridding it, emptying it, flushing it of collecting impressions. You know, like a magic mirror that I'm looking at Razak and now I'm looking at Kuan Yin and suddenly the faces are superimposed. You know, and collecting impressions from just everywhere. And pretty soon your being is just full of the impressions that you've collected, and there's no room for life. There's just, all there's room for is this continual recycling of more and more impressions. And when you begin to see through this lens, which means when you begin to perceive your own load of impressions as not you, but something that is simply accrued to you, which is the first step of becoming free of them in a real way. What begins to show up is the loads of impressions that everybody else is carrying. And so, you know, you see these 60-year-old people who look like they're 80. And they're all bent over and they've just got this load. And it's this load of life's impressions that they simply don't know how to release themselves from. Questions? Comments?
Can I make a comment?
Absolutely.
The image that you just gave is wonderful in relation to the two mirrors opposite each other,
Mm-hmm.
because it's something to really think about. What is between the two? If it's whatever it is, whether it's nature, opposite,
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is, if we're thinking of human beings and our minds, and that it being empty, it's also spacious.
Yeah.
That what is it that's coming up into my mirror and what's coming up into that mirror? And the impressions, therefore, if it's pure mirror, are illusion as we look at each other, but they're real at a certain level, at a human level.
They're real at a human level. Not knocking it. It's just life. It's just what it is. And
It's a wonderful note.
and yet there's a deeper depth that can be appreciated. One of the ways that this is taught in Zen is you simply face a blank wall. And at a certain point, it begins to penetrate that everything that you experience is an artifact of your own creation, because there's just nothing there but a blank wall, and where else is it going to come from? The work of the Sufi, therefore, is to investigate the truth about all things or persons whom one dislikes. By a keen observation of life, one gets to that barrier and understands what it is that makes one dislike or makes one like others. All fear, doubt, suspicion, misunderstanding, bitterness, or spite becomes cleared as soon as one touches that barrier which keeps souls apart. It is true that one need not force one's nature. It is not necessary to dislike what one likes or to take a liking to something that by nature one dislikes. Only one must know why one likes, if one likes, a certain thing, and the reason why one dislikes if one dislikes it.
I guess it's what children, when they reach a certain age, they're trying to throw off all the impressions they've been collecting. And it's like a natural state of attempting to awaken from the illusion.
I think, as you're speaking about this, what comes to me is that every developmental stage is an opportunity to sort of retire the load of impressions that pertain to the stage which one is leaving.
And that doesn't only pertain to children.
Most of us are examples of arrested development in some way, shape, or form. Almost all of us, even the most developed adepts on the planet, if you really look, you can see that they're examples of lopsided development, that there's something that's just really superbly masterful in one area and just not so much in some others. And so we'll find people who, like Sam Lewis, was supremely masterful in some things, and yet he had a very difficult personality. And it's just that's the aliveness of life. That's what makes it interesting. Mind develops to its fullness in the human being, although it exists in its primitive stage in all the different aspects of creation. Man, therefore, is so called from manas, which means in Sanskrit, mind. Many psychologists have thought that mind is the possession of the human being only, that the animal has no mind, but it is not so. Even the plants have a mind. Where there is feeling, there is mind. It's pretty obvious to anyone who has a pet that there's a little person in there. Even in rats, I mean, they have preferences. They have things that they, that it's not.
Not one rat is equal to another.
Yeah.
They're all different.
Even in fish, I've kept tropical fish for years, and they have not the same level of sort of personness, and virtually all of their acting is instinctual, but there is the part where they learn new things, and they have preferences. There is no difference between heart and mind, although heart expresses more than mind. The heart is the depth, and the surface is called mind. Plainly speaking, the depth of the mind is heart, and the surface of the heart is mind. Mind is a receptacle of all to which it is exposed. It is like the photographic plate. Therefore, all conditions, happy or unhappy, all actions, good or bad, all that is beautiful or void of beauty, becomes impressed upon the mind. Its first impression is on the surface, and as the impression is retained in the mind, so it reaches the depth of the heart. It is like a photographic plate. Once it is developed, the impression becomes clear and deeply engraved. But the photographic plate is not creative, and the heart is creative. Therefore, every impression which once reaches the heart becomes as a seed in fertile ground. The heart reproduces all that it has received. Therefore, it is to the great disadvantage of the fault-finding person that he wishes to find fault with all that he sees, for if he is not able to throw away immediately the undesirable impression received, which is not always so easy, he begins in due time to reproduce what he has received. Human nature is such that all bad things one sees in another seem to oneself worse than they are. But when oneself does the same, one always has a reason to defend it. You probably have friends who do this.
Still my best friend.
It is like the partaking of all that one dislikes in another only by the habit of fault-finding. It is like partaking all that one dislikes in another only by the habit of fault-finding. So, for the wise who have risen above the ordinary faults of human life, it matters little if they find fault, but they are the ones who do not criticize. They, as a rule, overlook all that seems undesirable, and that action of overlooking itself prevents all the undesirable impressions from penetrating through their hearts. There is a natural tendency, in the human as in the animal, to protect one's heart from all hurt or harm, but that is the external heart. If one only knew what harm is brought to one's being by letting any undesirable impression enter the heart, one would also adopt the above-mentioned policy of the wise to overlook.
You know, that just reminds me so much of what you said yesterday, that protection is overrated. That's kind of a different way of looking at it.
Mhm.
So if you're overlooking the undesirable, it cannot really penetrate. Because we were talking about, shielding yourself with a white light, and you said if you are that light or if you are that space, then things cannot really penetrate you. But that's another angle of seeing it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Uh-huh.
It's in his time when he was giving these teachings in the teens and the 1920s, it was like this revelation to the people of that time that what we see and judge in someone else is really a reflection of our own stuff. This was before Freud had published the bulk of his work, or done much of it, and the whole notion of projection was simply not understood. I mean, now we, at least in circles like this, we sort of take that for granted. We understand that to some degree. It's still worth considering when we think we see something to judge in those around us. And what he says here is absolutely true. When we judge something, we automatically partake of some portion of that which we're judging. The impression may have started in ourselves, and we're judging it out here by trying to push it away. I'm not that kind of person. I don't want that in my universe. Out, damn spot. It doesn't always mean that we have that same fault. That's a little bit simplistic. What it does mean, however, is that in that impression that we're suddenly kind of triggered or activated by, there's an issue for us. There's some little nugget of pain that we're pushing away from ourselves. There's some undigested impression. Impressions come at a lot of different levels. Some of them are artifacts of our psychodynamics, things that have been identified and articulated by conventional psychology. Some of them are psychic phenomena. And as we mentioned yesterday, there are some people whose minds are simply lint traps for the sort of psychic ebb and flow that moves through the there's a level of our mind which is like a radio receiver that just receives, hello, hi kitty cat, that just randomly receives broadcasts from it's a human, complete with cat toy. How? Yeah. Yeah. It's a chishti-colored cat. Well, that's what I would have said. So there's this level of our being that is more open to the mind world, which is not personal. It's collective. Some people are more permeable to that than others. There is the tendency for all of us to think that whatever we think and experience is something that we've created and therefore belongs to us. That's just one of the petty conceits of the ego, because it has no capacity really to experience outside of its own structure. And so we receive this stuff and we identify with it, and then, damn, it's ours. So this process of purifying the mind is in part not taking for granted everything that you think and feel as belonging to you or coming from you or something that needs your attention and your action. It's just not. And, as I said, if you identify with it, then you do in fact have to deal with it. There's a passage here somewhere where he talks about impressions as lines being engraved on the surface of the mind. And every time you follow one of those tracks, you engrave that line a little more deeply. And when we encounter an impression that is in some way in sync with or in alignment with one of the lines that are already engraved, we use that to engrave that line a little more deeply. This is exactly parallel to a psychodynamic concept of ego syntonic or ego dystonic. So, which is, the ego syntonic is the stuff that is harmonious with or in alignment with who we take ourselves to be. And so if somebody turns to you and says, I think you're a really horrible person and this is why, and if we've got lines like that in our minds that are similar to that, we'll just buy in. If we don't have a line like that, then, on a good day, we'll just look at them and go, what got under your saddle blanket? Or we may say, thank you for sharing. Which is it's how you tell somebody to buzz off in California. Is that a question? Yeah.
So that requires one to have consciousness of the line engraved.
Indeed.
And to the fact that people don't know that they...
Yeah. Well, it requires consciousness. I mean, in a sense, you already have consciousness of the line engraved, but if you're completely reactive to it, then, it's just another cog in your internal machinery. If you're really aware of it as a line, well, if you're aware of it as this is one of my issues, then you can take it to your therapist or talk to your friends or, read a self-help book or something. But to be really aware of the line as a line takes all the power out of it. You can even feel yourself reacting to it in a certain way, but not be compelled to act upon that. And so the reaction that you have doesn't provoke a further reaction, either moving towards it in identification or pushing it away, which is another kind of identification.
Which may be the case if someone says something to you and that you don't brush it off on saying thank you for sharing. You should entertain the possibility that is something for real. Again, assuming that you don't have consciousness of it, you're not aware of it. There could possibly be something that they should say thank you for.
Well, that's a judgment call.
And then
It really depends on the situation, of course. If somebody is giving you feedback or thinks they are, a couple of years ago, I was leading a zikr on the occasion of one of the verses of the saints in our lineage, not unlike the zikr we did last night. And someone who, I have to say, probably reads too many books, came to me afterwards and told me what was wrong with the zikr. Now, I've known this person for quite a number of years and have my own opinions about what she sees and how she sees it in her particular issues. And yet, I listened because I really wanted to get what was going on there. What is she really trying to say to me about her condition or what she experienced? Because there may be a nugget of something in that was real for me, and even though the signal-to-noise ratio was truly miserable, there may be something real in it that I want to hear. And so I really did listen. And most of it was nonsense. She just didn't like that I was cracking jokes at the beginning of the zikr, and she just had a judgment about it. she felt that somehow that was eroding my and our connection with the silsila, and it's just, and this is someone who is not a zikr leader, so.
Yeah, and real Sufis don't make jokes, right?
Well, whatever. Whatever. But I didn't just brush it off. I will always do what I can to really meet someone and receive their being, even though the communication itself could be complete nonsense. She needed to be recognized and received, and to have someone mirror to her fundamental value. And that's why I listened, aside from any benefit that might have accrued to me about, inside of her feedback. But the real thing is, so much of the distress that people create with one another and their upsets is because somebody felt unseen, unheard, unvalued, ungranted space and being.
It seems to me also that it has to do with having an image of how things really are that may need to be shattered.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the rigidity there, where this is the only way this can be.
True. And most of the things that surface as upsets in people are their needs to have a sense, at some level, of control, making things understandable, not getting surprised by the aliveness of life. I find that people are often more afraid of life than they are of death.
I had a wonderful long laundry list of all the reasons why my husband was, causing me grief in my life. And I finally started praying for some humility. And when I did, this is really scary, praying for humility, because you will get whomped, and you will get shattered. But when I look back on my life now and I think about all the ways I was able to make him wrong, and couldn't see any of those little patterns in myself that were really obnoxious, and how I was bringing on any problems that I was having. Years and years it took me to be able to see it. And I look back and I say, why couldn't I see that? And it seems so clear to everybody else. They can tell. They know what you're doing. But to get a view of it ourselves, it's probably the most scary thing in the world to pray for humility and then see how you've created it all yourself.
Yeah. It really means giving up structure. It means giving up predictability. It means giving up control, but we don't have that control anyway. That's not the dance. The statistical likelihood of our very existence, each one of us, is so minute that it's completely lost in the rounding error of the calculation. And we think we have some control? Come now. And yet we fight tooth and nail.
I think it's someone like Merchant Sam, what's so delightful about him is that he
try to hide his flaws. He was perfectly able to just expose himself with the flaws.
I have a riff about that, and I'll make it really short. One of the attributes of the soul, along with light and birthlessness, deathlessness, is value, intrinsic value. The divine name is Al-Mu'iz. And the value of the soul, the value of being, is an absolute, the way truth is an absolute, beyond the distinctions and the polarities of mind. There are, like infinity is an absolute. Value, the value of being is an absolute, the way infinity is an absolute. And in this culture, we socialize children by contingent valuation. You're good if you do this thing, and you're bad if you do this other thing. And we get enough of that, and enough of the distress and the rage of parents and society, and we become deeply wounded and cut off from that intrinsic, implicit sense of just having value and of belonging. You know, you're a child of the universe kind of thing. It's a real thing. It's not a platitude. And it's not even so much that we have a right to be here, we simply are by the very act of being. It's truth, it's rightness. And we carry these deep wounds, these deep disconnects from this foundational sense of the rightness of simply being, that our existence is supported by existence itself, without any question. And the tendrils of these wounds reach into almost all the areas of our functioning and the structure of the personality. And so when someone gets upset with you about something, it's very easy to see that somehow that wound has been kind of re-stimulated, and the deep, deep pain that results from this feeling of separation from the divine ground of being. It's why people bitch and complain about paying a reasonable tuition to attend a seminar. And they want a scholarship. And the ones that complain the loudest, spiritual teaching comes from God, and therefore it should be free to the whole universe. And then they fall asleep, and they talk, and they come late, and they just, the whole sense of valuing is so damaged that they can't really receive what's there. They can't really take advantage of the privilege of being present when a teaching is being given. And there's a lot of other manifestations.